Hello and welcome to The Pig Edge, Teagasc's pig podcast with me, Amy Quinn. Our podcast series covers the latest news, information and advice to keep Irish pig farmers up to date with the industry. We are continuing to focus on some of the research being carried out in the Pig Development Department, and my guest this episode is Teagasc Researcher Maria Costa, who's going to discuss the PATHSURVPIG or PSP project that many producers were involved in over the last few years. I first asked Maria to remind us what this project is all about.
It was a big project between Teagasc, UCD, the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, the Cork Institute of Technology, and it was actually funded by DAFM, so by the Department of Agriculture. And it was a big project whose main objective was actually to investigate respiratory disease in Irish pig farms, but also risk factors and the relationship between respiratory disease and performance, welfare, and also antimicrobial use. So these projects took more or less 4 years, and it included several longitudinal studies. And these longitudinal studies are studies where we follow the pigs from birth to slaughter. So we individually tag pigs from birth to slaughter. And then we also did some cross-sectional study where we just collected information on different farms, about 70 farms in different areas like biosecurity, feed, vaccination, and we followed these pigs to the slaughterhouse.
And why is respiratory disease so important in pig production?
So the reason why we picked this area, I like to go ahead with this such a big study involving so many institutions, is that because actually just respiratory disease has been, the problems with it have been increasing over time. So we know that because we are rearing more pigs under one house and one same roof, they're all sharing the same airspace, it tends to worse, or at least it's harder to actually manage disease when we have so many animals. We know that it greatly affects performance. There's lots of papers, and we also know that from the farm for our own data. And it's also a major reason for antimicrobial use in Ireland. And this comes after a survey, it was done in 2014, where we just asked farmers what was the main reason for which they were using antimicrobials, and the large majority of them said antimicrobial use. And it's also because respiratory disease, I'm not talking about one particular agent, because the problem related to this is that it's actually a complex. It's a disease complex. And by this, I mean that it's actually, there's many agents involved in this respiratory disease entity that I'm talking about.
Maria, can you tell us a bit more about that disease complex you mentioned?
So actually, yeah, the technical term is really porcine respiratory disease complex. And it's a complex because it involves management and environment. And this is actually a very important part. And I actually mean, the dust, the ammonia levels, everything we do on the farm. Bacteria and viruses. So these are the agents that would be causing disease. But within these complex, we have some that are primary agents like mycoplasma and like PRRS or the blue ear, which would be the agents which, like, if we are positive to those, we are kind of opening the door for other secondary infections by other agents. It doesn't really matter which ones. It just matters that once you have one of these or both or even more on the same farm, you're actually much more prone to have other problems with respiratory disease, not just related to these specific agents. So it's all together, it's a bigger problem.
You were mostly involved in the cross-sectional study of this project, Maria. What did this involve?
So this cross-sectional study was actually done in two main parts. The first part was where we were visiting farms to ask about their biosecurity practices. We also wanted to know what was the herd health status of these farms, and we also asked questions about vaccination, some feeding strategies as well. And then we wanted to assess how this information we got from the farms directly would relate to the things that we can see in the slaughterhouse. So then after the first phase of the study, which was this major survey we did on the farm, we followed these farms to the slaughterhouse, and we checked many batches of these farms, and we checked the lung lesions, lungs, heart and liver lesions, and we also collected blood samples to study the presence of some of these primary agents we were talking about for the disease complex. respiratory disease complex. And then this was actually the most intensive part of the project as well. All the slaughterhouse visits, we had to be there. It was the winter of 2017 to 2018, 5 months of everyday visiting a certain slaughterhouse. And this was, we collected a large amount of data that then was able to inform us about all the things we were looking after.
And what else did you find, Maria?
So from the first part of the project, when we looked into the management and the biosecurity practices on the farm, actually the results that were able to tell us that in terms of external biosecurity, we were actually quite good. I mean, compared to other European countries that use the same survey. And one of the reasons could be because most of the Irish pig farms are actually breeding their own gilts instead of buying other gilts from outside. But we also saw that the internal biosecurity was not so good. I mean, and this is in line with what we have in other European countries as well. That means that the practices we have inside the farm are not very good in terms of keeping disease from spreading inside the farm. And this would be important to control disease between different batches, for instance.
And what were the main reasons for low internal biosecurity?
The thing with the biosecurity is that, to my point of view, we still have very heterogeneous pig farms in Ireland. So it's a bit difficult when we have very old buildings and very new buildings, and the organization of the farm is not so straightforward to be able to stop us from going from the sows, from the maternities, from the farrowing houses to the weaners, and then to the finishers. Sometimes it happens that we go to the finishers first, and we go back to the farrowing houses, then we go to the weaners, which is not the way we should be going. We should always be going from the youngest animals to the oldest animals, and we should always look after the healthy animals first, and then at the end of the day or later on we would go and check the diseased animals, because if we don't do this way, we'll be bringing disease from one compartment to the others. That's one of the main things, but it's a bit difficult to implement because we have our habits, our routines so well developed that it's very difficult to change that.
And how do these biosecurity results compare to other European countries?
So we know that, for the external biosecurity, we know that it is actually higher in Ireland than it is in other countries. One of the reasons for that could be that we are actually, most of the pig farms are breeding their own gilts instead of purchasing them from other farms, but also they tend to have fences. They don't really have, for instance, like showers, but many farms are in a good location. They're not wild boars around. All of these things count for the external biosecurity.
And what exactly were you checking for in the slaughterhouse?
So in the slaughterhouse, we were looking for lung lesions, so we were just going to the slaughter line and looking at all the lungs, the hearts, and the livers, and we were assessing their lesions. So pneumonia, pleurisy, also pericarditis with the inflammation around the heart, and milk spots on the liver. And we were also collecting blood samples from these finisher pigs we were assessing. So overall, we assessed about 60 farms at slaughter from those 70 farms that did the biosecurity survey initially. And we assessed at least 2 batches per farm with an average of 167 lungs checked for every batch. And overall, for this winter season that we were visiting the slaughterhouses, we assessed more than 27 pigs at slaughter. So we have a large amount of data that is able to inform us what is actually happening on each one of these farms, and altogether what is happening in this study sample of farms in Ireland. And we know that actually these farms represent about 30% of the Irish pig herd. From the amount of sows we had in our study, but we cannot exactly say that this is a representative sample because we didn't select them randomly. So all we can say it's that these farms should be representative of the Irish pig farms that are enrolled within the Teagasc Advisory Service, because we selected them through the advisors, through our Teagasc advisors, but we don't know how similar this would be to the farms that are not enrolled in our services. We don't know how different they are, so that's why we cannot say that these results are meaningful for all the farms in in Ireland. And our average herd size, just for you to have a reference figure, in this study sample, in these 60 farms, we had an average herd size of 790 sows. And the smallest farm had 109 sows, and the biggest farm had 2,500 sows.
And what were the main findings from this part of the study?
So the things that we found in terms of serology, and by serology I mean once we took the bloods, we sent them to the lab, to our partner in the Cork Institute of Technology, and they were analyzing all these bloods. They were doing these tests to detect antibodies against 4 main respiratory disease pathogens. So we looked at 2 viruses, so the influenza A virus, or the flu, the porcine reproductive and respiratory syndrome virus, or PRRS, blue ear, and then also 2 bacteria, Mycoplasma pneumoniae, which is known as enzootic pneumonia mostly, and Actinobacillus leishmaniae, which is APP. So from these, we saw that about 79% or 80% of the farms that we tested were positive for flu and for Mycoplasma, and about 59% of the farms were positive to PRRS, or blue ear, and we saw that virtually all of the farms were positive to APP on these tests for antibodies. So this bug seems to be everywhere. It doesn't really tell us if this is a problem or not, because we know from the literature that actually it's very normal that every farm is positive to APP. It's more that we actually have to go next and we have to find which strains are circulating so we can tell, in particular for APP, if this is a problem or not. And in terms of the lung checks, what we saw in general, when we look at the lesions we have on the lungs compared to other countries, they were a bit similar, even though these really changed a lot according to the season and according to the diseases that are circulating. But we saw that the levels of pleurisy on average were about 12% for the dorsal caudal pleurisy. And then of pneumonia, we had an average of 13%, but the average surface affected, so even though the lung was affected, the average surface that was affected was only 6.2%, so it doesn't seem to be very severe. But we also had 14% of scars, and scars are the healing lesion of pneumonia. But a pig could have had pneumonia without leaving a scar, so maybe there was even a larger percentage of pigs that had pneumonia, and we didn't have any indication when we got to slaughter, because he could have had this problem earlier in the lifetime of the pig. And then for pericarditis, we had an average of 7.4%. And then surprisingly, the thing that we think would be the most controllable one, which would be milk spots on the liver, we had an average of 28.6% on farm. And we had a huge range. We had farms without any milk spots whatsoever in any liver of any batch. And we had farms that had one batch up to 93% of all the livers affected, which is a lot. But so we should look into this and maybe investigate a little bit more on the warming protocols we have and make sure that we are following them. So following these are like the main results. We got all the data together and we tried to model production performance. So we had, because these farms were Teagasc clients, we did these models where we tried to predict how much was the production performance of certain farms based on their respiratory disease health status, on their information. And what we were able to do is actually very interesting, because some of these models we built were able to explain up to 40% in the variation of, say, average daily gain. So if we had 70 farms and we have an average daily gain of say 800 grams per day, and some farms will have lower average daily gain, other farms will have higher average daily gain, and we are able to explain 40% of these differences based on information we got. And we were also able to do the same for, say, average for the age at sale, and this is quite impressive on this type of study because we didn't control for other factors. So just with what we were able to gather, explaining 40% is pretty amazing, considering that we are not even taking into account gastrointestinal diseases or the management or even the feed, which is very important for average daily gain.
So what do these results mean for pig producers?
We are actually able to take very practical conclusions from this study. So first of all, the prevalence of these diseases is important in Ireland. Like we saw, all of them are above 50%. So we have more than double of our farms, more than half of our farms affected by some of these diseases. And there is a clear influence of respiratory disease on production performance. PRRS and pleurisy, for example, had a major impact on our production performance parameters. And as we were saying before, we built these models to predict production performance from the data, and this included vaccination, serology, and the prevalence of lung lesions. But when we look in particular at these two models I was talking about before, I will give you an idea, a more practical idea of what this means. So if we look at the model that we built for average daily gain, we see very plainly that farms that are positive to PRRS are losing 31 grams per day in average daily gain compared to farms that don't have PRRS. And this is very big. 31 grams per day in average daily gain is massive. But we also see that these farms that have an average cranial pleurisy, which is one of the other types of pleurisy we're looking after, the average in Ireland was 9.3. So if you have 9.3% of your pigs with this pleurisy, you already are losing 19 grams per day in average daily gain compared to farms that don't have cranial pleurisy. But the thing is, because this is a linear scale, you can see the more you have, the more cranial pleurisy you have, or the more pleurisy you have, the more you will lose. So this is why it's important to look at our lung checks every quarter, every 3 months, regularly, and informed by your vet, so you can see where do you stand. And if you're actually able to compare yourself to your peers, then you'll know how bad or how well are you doing. So just a little bit further, if you have 15% of cranial pleurisy as opposed to 9.3%, you're losing 30 grams per day. And if you have 20%, you're losing 40 grams per day. So this is very important to know so that we can control these factors and these risk factors to actually increase our performance. And when we look at another model, when we look at the age at sale, for instance, we similarly, we can see in here that the farms that were positive to PRRS take an extra 6-7 days to reach the slaughter weight. That's 1 week extra. That's a lot. And in terms of space and of farm logistics and management, it's a big problem. And also in this model, pleurisy came up as well as something important. So again, if we had a farm that had 9% of pleurisy, in cranial pleurisy in here, it will take them 3.7 or 4 days longer to reach the slaughter weight, so the age to reach the slaughterhouse. And the more you have, the worse it will be. So the longer it will take for you to get there. So if you have 15% of cranial pleurisy, then the pigs will take 6 extra days to reach a slaughter weight. And if you have 20%, it's 8 extra days, and so on. So many farmers were not aware of the impact these had on their farms. So especially farmers with PRRS or mycoplasma or a high prevalence of lung lesions, this was a very good opportunity to call their vets and to discuss the control of disease on their farms.
So what would you say, Maria, is the next step when it comes to research in this area?
So we are still working with some of these data. I know that at the moment, one of our partners of this big project, our partners in CIT, are trying to, they are sending some of these samples we took at the slaughterhouse, especially the lung samples, for analysis, so we can have data on the APP strains that are circulating in Ireland. This is something that people have been asking us to do. And I know that actually there's some parallel work being developed in the Department of Agriculture to try to identify these APP strains. And it's important because we know from the literature, again, that there's not necessarily a cross protection against across the different APP serotypes, and this is one of the reasons why sometimes the vaccines may work or may not work. And by cross protection, I mean if we have the different serotypes or the different strains in our farm, sometimes just because we get one doesn't mean that we are protected against the one that our neighbor has, which is important, which makes it even more important not to mix pigs and make sure that we have a strict biosecurity not to infect everyone. So what we did so far were just the first steps in order to understand pig respiratory disease in Irish pig farms. So now we have a baseline, a background from where to start researching some other things. One of the things that I think would be very interesting would be to map disease. I think with some of the data we have, or even if we start collecting some of these data at the slaughterhouse, we could actually go to a map and having the geolocation of our farms, we could plot it and we could see where are the farms that are positive to PRRS, what are those that are positive to mycoplasma, and if they are grouped together like these 10 farms that are neighbors or the other ones that are free. We can even see if there's an influence of the winds and the fields that are passing by, and if there's any influence of the roads that are around, because we know that the pig transports are one of the big issues. But those are all things that we can look at the future and that seem to be promising. But the next step and the most immediate one, which we already started doing, is modeling the economic impact of respiratory disease on farm. And we started doing this with a recently developed pig economic model. And so we can feed all of these data and we can actually model the estimate costs of each of these diseases we have on the farm based on this Teagasc pig production model. And then continuing from this, we know that Animal Health Ireland and the Department of Agriculture are launching their AM, PM, or antemortem and post-mortem inspection on sites. So the TVIs and the veterinary inspectors will actually assess on the slaughterhouse directly onto their tablets the prevalence of lung lesions, and so this can be used to inform farmers on a regular basis, as opposed to just doing this in a research project like we did. And Animal Health Ireland is picking up from this. They're already doing the biosecurity surveys every year, which the Department of Agriculture is paying vets to do on farms. So it's totally free from producers, and it gives you a tool to assess how you're doing on your farm and how do you evolve year to year. And you should set up goals to improve this every year. And then with this, all the information that we'll get from the slaughterhouse, there's no more excuses not to monitor your respiratory disease or your herd health status regularly.
Finally, Maria, what advice would you give a pig producer on how to monitor respiratory disease on their farm?
So the first thing that I would do would be to have the herd health status defined. So I think this is the most important and the key thing before doing anything else. But of course, to do this, you first have to call your vet. And the second step would be actually to gather the team. So we know that working on the farm is not just the farmer, it's the farmer, then there's the vet, there's the advisor, there's the nutritionist, there's the geneticist sometimes. All of these people that are working with one farmer and in one farm should get together, and there should be a plan that should be designed for the herd health of that farm. So whether you want to tackle a specific issue, you can talk about disease elimination protocols or controls or vaccination updates of those farms. And then you should also monitor your respiratory disease through slaughterhouse checks every quarter at the very least. And serology eventually every year, depending on your herd health status and what you're trying to achieve with your herd health plan. And then eventually even update or adapt vaccination plans whenever it's necessary. These would be the key things that I would advise.
Thanks very much, Maria.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of The Pig Edge, and thanks to Maria for joining me on the show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify so you never miss a show, And for more farming information, go to teagasc.ie. Until next time, I'm Amy Quinn. Thanks for listening.